Welcome to Waterford Writers Weekend. My name is Deirdre Dwyer and I am delighted to be in conversation with Sara Baume. Hi Sarah, how are you?
Hello.
We're winging our way from our separate areas. I'm coming in from the top of the town in Waterford. And Sarah, where are you at the moment?
I'm just outside Skibbereen in West Cork. I'm at the top of a hill, but there's nothing around it.
So I thought we would kick off with a little reading. We're here to talk about handiwork, Sarah's beautiful book that came out earlier this year. And so we thought it might be a good place to start with a small reading to give us a bit of context for our conversation. So Sarah, when you're ready, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm going to read the very beginning because it more or less puts the genesis of it in context. I didn't beat around the bush. This was where it started, and this is where the book started. So it starts with a kind of a mouthful of a quote, but bear with me because the quote comes back. Amateurs, Stephen Knott writes in Amateur Craft, History and Theory, have their own convoluted, inefficient, and superfluous processes of production that reflect their subjectivity and freedom from the obligation to produce a defined output. There is an Alaskan songbird, the northern wheatear. She weighs about as much as a small ball of wool, and every autumn she flies about as far as 300,000 small balls of wool, unspooled in a westerly direction, disentangled across Siberia and Kazakhstan and Iraq and Saudi Arabia, finally coming to a definitive stop in East Africa. It takes her 3 months to get there and 2.5 months to get back again, and so the northern wheatear devotes almost half of every year to these journeys, which she makes out of countless individual flaps, beating her wings continuously against winds prevailing and preternatural over the course of 30,000 kilometers of sky. There are easier routes she could take. There are places with clement climates far closer to Alaska than sub-Saharan Africa. But the northern wheatear doesn't choose them. She doesn't choose at all. Every autumn, she follows the route her ancestors initiated at the end of the last ice age 10,000 years ago, the convoluted, inefficient, superfluous directions that are her genetic inheritance. And then, in spring, she goes the same way back again. I hear the story of the northern wheatear on a day in spring from a podcast which I listen to, sitting in the straight-back chair at the eastern end of the living room table. I sit there every day between the hours of 12 and 4, parallel to the windowsill and overshadowed by a row of books, a Christmas cactus, a dusty globe which encapsulates a long expired light bulb. When I retell a version of the story of the journey of the northern wheatear to Mark later in the evening, a slightly erroneous, airily embellished version, he remarks that there are fish who swim against the current, salmon and herring, who live in the open sea but are compelled to travel back to the rivers and streams in which they were born in order to spawn. And this gives me cause to remember a tiny goldfish I owned for a year or so in my early 20s, who, on the occasion of having her water changed, would make every effort to resist being poured from a corner of her narrow tank into a giant mayonnaise jar. The goldfish would go to the place where the last of the water pooled as the glass was lifted. She would tilt her face to point in the opposite direction of the tilt. She would push against the force of gravity and the flow of water, wriggling her entire body as if burrowing upwards through thick soil. So that's the beginning.
Lovely. We had a quick chat yesterday in which I confessed that I had been waiting for my physical copy of the book to arrive, and so have been listening blissfully to the RTE Book on One, which will be available now for the next 4 weeks, your installment. So, and it was so such a beautiful way to absorb the words, and then so different when the physical copy finally arrived to have the words in front of me. And also the setup felt really different because there's a much bigger flow when I'm listening to you reading, in terms of the physical copy has bigger distinction between thoughts, I guess, because it flips onto the next page. So that was a really fascinating experience for me to have both the auditory experience, which could exist with me in my real life as I'm going day to day and chopping onions and looking out my window at our birds here, and then whereas the act of reading is a really different one. It's much more insular and it's much more me and the page. So I mean, just an interesting observation about the way that I've absorbed this book, and really feel like a double presence of the book. When I got the physical copy and started looking at it, I'm immediately flashing back to the task I was doing when I heard it. So even in that section, you're talking about the podcast and the auditory while you're making your work. And is that something that you write about it in the book, but is that something that happens to you when you're making, that you do a lot of listening?
I'm not someone who reads stuff back, and this is like one of the basic rules of creative writing. People always say, "Oh, read it aloud and hear it," and I don't really do that. It's like I can hear it in my head without having to read it aloud. But definitely the structure and the look of the thing on the page meant an awful lot to me. And I had a very interesting conversation years ago with an artist called Maggie Madden. And I was writing a text for her exhibition. And it was pre-exhibition, so I was visiting her in the studio. But she talked about these very sort of small, slight objects in a way, but how giving them lots of space, giving them lots of white around them on the wall, kind of forced people to look harder and to think more deeply. And that always stuck with me. So I thought, how can I do this in a book? And it's by no means original, but I found myself thinking a lot about how if something was important, I would give it more space on the page. So it's like the more important it is, the less words there are in a way. And I had a very keen sense of like, that's just one fragment, and then on the next page, like a painting on a wall, then there's a big gap, and then there's another one. But then you think of a show like, say, in the Royal Academy in London, or in Dublin in the RHA, where you go in and there's like, the paintings are jointed, they're absolutely crammed together on the wall, and you're kind of overwhelmed. You can't really look at anything. So that was the sensibility that I was going for.
Yeah, which really comes across in the physicality of it, but it's also, just hearing you talk about it now, it's like you're curating the words. So that kind of leads us on to, all of the publicity about the book has been leaning into the fact that you are both a visual artist and a writer, and that those are kind of two separate idioms in which you work, and that then this might be the bringing together of them. So it makes loads of sense that you would be both including visuals, but also curating the image on the page as it is, in that way, like it's a gallery, like you're enforcing the important with the placement in a visual way. So that's really, really interesting. And so that kind of leads us on to the pairing of why Emer Chasey, thank you very much, Emer, for having us, picked me to do it. So I'm a theatre maker, but mostly a costume and set designer. So when she first approached me, she was saying, this might be an interesting conversation, because in the way that Sarah is caught between two artistic outputs, similarly the design kind of blends in somewhere between the theatre and the visual art. So that was really interesting to me. And when I listen to or read the work, I'm wildly jealous. I haven't done the visual art practice. I haven't gone to art school where you have the freedom to really go into work. Mine always has to have a function and a purpose. And there was kind of hints of that in your writing about things that do not have function. And does that spark anything with you there?
Well, what I remembered when you were saying that is I studied in IADT Dunleary, or it was called DLIADT or something at the time. But anyway, I would have been in the fine art department, which is now I think the visual art department. But anyway, and then in IADT, it's also the National Film School, and there was like animation and graphic design and various other departments. And there was always like this sort of tension between, say, the students who are doing design, something sort of formalized and practical, with rules attached that they would get jobs at the end of and make money, and then the fine art people who are just like, hopeless dreamers smoking pot in the playground kind of thing. And that was the stereotype. But I often wonder, like, it's something else that so I'm not really answering the question, but it struck me that we have in common is that you're always beginning with, you're always visualizing the thing, I suppose. What you have at the beginning of every project is a strong picture in your head of what you want it to be at the end, and then you're taking the various steps to get there. And I've always worked in that way, and I don't know if I would have done if I'd studied English, say, or if I'd gone straight to university and studied creative writing. But what my art background has kind of given me is the picture in my head that then you go through the various different steps to realize, and that applies to writing just as much. Like, I'm not sure, I think if I'd studied writing, I would never have become a visual artist, but becoming a visual artist sort of allowed me to write, or studying visual art allowed me to also work as a writer.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it does. And it's funny because you write about that in the book. There is there's a chapter or a section on how you have the finished picture. And as I was reading that, I went, ooh, my practice is much more, it kind of emerges. So, and because it's so collaborative, so that's part of the stuff that I love about my work, is that it's not me on my own. So in that way that I'm not jealous. So it's me with a team, and together we make it. So you never get the luxury of picturing it and getting it just as you pictured it, because
Yeah.
it's always a little journey of compromise, which is what I really love about it. It's the kind of the joined up brain, you know, the kind of organism of a theater company or a making of a production that sparks for me. But I think I do have a longing to have the creative control and the power to have one image and have it not have to mean any, not that it won't mean anything, but not have to have it serve anything else apart from the image. So that is interesting in that way. Though of course you ultimately end up with the picture in your head that you're working to get to.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
maybe that's the essential difference, that in design, say you're starting with a picture in your head, but then you also have to make it fit the format, and you have to fit in with the other people who are doing it. And maybe you're working for a client, so you have to satisfy the client or whatever. Whereas in fine art, you're trying to get it, you're trying to make it true to the original picture in your own head, which is a harder thing really, because you're your own worst critic ever. And I mean, I write about discards as well, the amount of stuff that gets thrown away. But the collaborative thing, it's funny you mentioned control, and I think that's the major thing with collaboration. We talked about it a little bit yesterday, and I was thinking this morning is you have to cede control. Really, you have to have a knack for ceding control, but you have to also be able to like maintain just enough of a balance of control to be able to get the thing finished, and not argue with everyone or whatever, to get it
And
done right.
and to feel like it is yours as well, because that's when it doesn't, that's when the process is not successful, when something is out there and though your name is on it and you have made it, it doesn't feel like yours. So it's most rewarding when it does feel like yours, even though there's been everybody else's input. And I'm thinking just thinking about the compromises that you need to do. Working with dancers is a really beautiful part of my job, but then there's the awareness of their bodies. With many actors, they can wear something that is slightly uncomfortable and that might help them. With dancers, it was a whole new awareness when I was working with them, that the thing has to function so perfectly that they don't even know that they're wearing it, because it can't impede them in any way. Because something that's too scratchy or too loose will cause an issue. So it was just, yeah, those are some of the compromises you have to make when you're
and really, doesn't it work best if you're working with someone, say like a dancer, who, like in my case for example, would have I don't dance, I've no awareness of my body and so they're the best person to define that, whereas it must be much harder to work with. I never really collaborate with writers or with artists because it's too close to my own. I too much need to be making the decisions, because I know the terrain. Whereas when I did a project for Cork Midsummer Festival in 2018, with Peter Power and a whole team of people. And in a way, it was such sort of unknown territory for me. It worked really well because I could just do the small bit that I did and then watch it become something else at the hands of people who knew better.
And that brings us on. So kind of another thing that I was thinking about was, and your reading at the beginning is exemplary of that as a writer, you don't necessarily, or I'm not sure you can tell me whether you necessarily imagine yourself to be having to present your own work when you begin. So that level of having to read, and since I've now been researching you, listening to loads of your readings in various ways, and realizing that in fact, early in once the lockdown had eased and we were allowed to go back out to the sea, one evening when coming back from a swim, we were listening to the radio and the second last chapter was playing, and I hadn't even been aware that it was you. But when I listened to that, which came out on the 23rd, I was going, this is the part that I've already heard. So the idea that you have to perform your work, and is that a comfortable phrase even for me to say? Do you feel you perform it, and how does that feel as a part of your practice, I suppose?
Well, it's not something I thought about at all, because when you start writing, you want things to get published, but you never jump onto the part where you're maybe actually getting published and such to the point that people want to publicize your work and such that you will have to sort of read it. And I never jumped that far, really. And yet now, you know, in a complete contrast to the way it was, you know, sort of 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, 10 years ago, probably, it very much a writer's role is to go out and perform their work. And some writers like Kevin Barry, I always think of him in this context, because he talks about how he was reluctant, and then he started doing it, and he realized that he had this actor inside him that was crawling to get out. And the way he reads is just mesmerizing. And the same as well, I think the good poets really read their work beautifully because they know exactly, you know, where the stresses should be and what the feeling is. But prose is harder to read. And I don't really mind doing it. I've gotten used to it, but I don't relish it. I haven't missed it this year. You know, I've been doing far less in terms of public events than I would have done. I like radio. Radio is a nice medium, but I hate the sound of my voice. Don't we all? But I always feel like I should have a disclaimer that's like, Sarah sounds posh, but is in fact a poor artist. And I find I do it better in conversation. It depends on who I'm talking to, but I can't do it when I'm doing like a monologue. I can't play up my Cork accent, but in conversation with other people from Cork, I can play it up a little, and that's the version that I like.
But it's so funny because, and radio has become such part, certainly that kind of leads us into talking a little bit about lockdown and the new lockdown. And that's why we're here digitally rather than on the stage, where we would have been feeding back or getting feedback from an audience in live space. But so certainly for me, the radio and audio, I've just listened to the Everyman in Cork have been putting out Play It By Ear, so a series of live performances that they're putting out digitally. And last Saturday night, I found myself not sure what to do with my hands. We're so used to watching, and so on a Saturday night listening to a live radio play, it took me like back to an imagined time much before my lifetime, where I was sitting and I took out crochet. Like that was what I needed to do, something with my hands. I couldn't quite figure out how to sit on the sofa in front of the fire and listen and not do something. So I think that's a really interesting part of lockdown life, and how people are leaning into the audio for an experience of liveness, or this digital. But I do think that the separation of the audio is giving us all an interesting challenge in terms of theatrical creation as well. And certainly my experience of handiwork is now always going to be twinned with this audio version.
Yeah.
But like
it's funny you mentioned that, because handiwork is very much about this kind of this fidgetiness that I have with my hands, coming not from art school, but from way before, from childhood, and coming from my dad, because I talk about how he couldn't sit still. He had to be in the shed, or asleep pretty much, or eating, or asleep, or having a pint or something. But I have the same, so I can't sit down and watch television in the evening without doing something, even if it's really absorbing. I have to be like, I do cross stitch generally in the evenings because it's the easiest thing to do sitting down. But I'll also paint, I'll do any number of things. And then the same with podcasts. I listen to them and to radio a lot when I'm working with my hands. I mean, also when I'm writing, but I don't really listen when I'm writing. I just let it play, and I like the sort of sound of it. But I think it's, it baffles me that people that podcasts haven't also, the massive rise of podcasts haven't also led to the massive rise of handicraft, because you need something to be looking at.
Well, so it's my accompaniment for a walk or cooking, but also when, so that was leading us into lockdown. And so in my experience of lockdown, I got a little sense of what it might be like to be retired. So the rug was pulled. I hope there's no retired people who will find that offensive. But the rug was pulled out from under our professional world, the theatre's professional world. And so kind of from having worked at breakneck pace for a long time, and particularly traveling a lot with my work, I was suddenly still. And so things like the garden became a really strong focus, birds, but also I'm not a great drawer, which has always been a kind of I have felt a lack of that, because I think it's such a beautiful way of communicating in terms of design, costume design particularly, because the model is three-dimensional. So that way of making has always been fine, but the drawing. So I took some classes, digital classes in watercoloring, and found that such an absorbing way to work. And how was your lockdown? Was it different for you, or much the same?
Oh, much the same. It's funny you mentioned retirement, because I have a novel coming out not till 2022 now, but it has sort of a lot in common with handiwork. It's sort of like the imagined universe of it. But there's a line in it that says they lived as if already in retirement. And that was from me. So it sort of struck me one day that I had a lot in common with these retired people who were talking on the radio. And the major difference being I don't have a guaranteed income. That's I don't get free fuel or anything. But I think that that definitely struck a chord, and I think a lot of people, probably retired people, fared better than better than the young fidgety amongst us. But anyway, no, sorry. So lockdown. Here I always I by default you sort of complain, but I really have so little to complain about. Many times I've thought I'm so lucky that in a way the pandemic was at this stage of my life when I'm not single. I have a place to live. I work from home anyway. My partner works from home. We live in the countryside. I mean, I even have, my landlady said to us at the beginning of all this, look, if you can't pay the rent, that's fine. And I thought, God, I mean, we have been able to pay the rent, but I've been lucky in nearly all things. So if anything, it's been a period marked by worry for other people and worry for the future. So that's kind of slightly unsettling, but there's also sort of, you sort of pull up an inner strength, like when it's funny, it's suddenly like, I previous to the pandemic, I've sort of always lived as if a catastrophe is just around the corner, and now the catastrophe has happened, and you're sort of like, okay, well, what now? I mean, I've heard people who've been diagnosed with cancer sort of say something similar. My mother, who had cancer, said something similar. She worried all her life about getting cancer, and then when she got cancer, she was kind of like, oh well, here it is now. How do I deal with this? So there's been a touch of that. It's been productive, but it's been productive in the sense that suddenly everything, that all of the events outside of the house were taken away, and so that time was given back to me for work. But I kind of hoped that I'd do more things like, clear out the clutter and clean the windows and plant vegetables. But I didn't. I just continued to do all of the same little sort of art-based things. Nothing domestic at all, unfortunately.
Well, I think that's because that's a symptom of your life. So because it wasn't so disrupted, it would be much more of a wrench to disrupt that pattern or whatever.
Yeah.
And my partner did say that when the second lockdown came, he went, "Oh, now we can clean the windows," because so this will suddenly be the moment that we get to clean the windows and do those things. And then to go on, so one of the real touchstones for me during lockdown, hilariously, which was why when reading and listening to the book, was my garden birds. And so I so empathized with your struggle to coax birds to your garden. And so while I'm up in a very kind of we have a beautiful tree in the garden that was planted, I believe, from our neighbours in the 50s, brought home from Woolworths from the bargain bucket in the 50s, and is now a 20-foot tall silver birch. And so we always had lots of birds in the garden when we moved back here a year ago. But goldfinches had really been the ones that I was trying to coax, and I'd seen other people's successes with Niger seed. So bought Niger seed at ridiculous expense, shipping it in the really heavy lockdown from a shop that you had to just get online. They were only online once a week, and then nothing for 2-3 months. We had the seed up. The sparrows were delighted with other seed, and the blackbirds were still hopping around. But once then, about 8 weeks later, we had our first goldfinch, and now we have a resident flock, which fills me with such joy.
Wow.
So when I'm looking out the window, there's nearly always 1 or 2 little goldfinches spitfiring around the bird seed. But so how were the birds, and how are the birds now for you?
Oh, like I'm very lightly jealous of your goldfinches.
My sister is as well.
We get a scattering of them in sort of early summer, and they eat the dandelion seeds. So you'll see them actually plucking up. Maybe I mentioned that, or I definitely mentioned it in either that or the other one. But they pull the once the dandelions have gone to seed, they pull off the fluffy bits and then eat the seed at the bottom. And I've heard they're not so gone on the feeder, but yeah, threaded through handiwork is our struggles to, like, sort of close to the beginning of the book, Mark and I moved to this new place, which is on a windy hill in West Cork. So there's not much by way of trees. And like, we literally didn't think we'd seen any small birds. You know, there's gulls, and I mentioned that, and crows. And we kind of make a half-hearted attempt that I mean, I talked briefly yesterday on the phone about how sort of some things are true and not true, and our struggles with the birds were, I mean, they're true, but they kind of went on for years, whereas in the book they're kind of stretched out over the course of a single year. And we just weren't trying that hard. And then at a certain point I started to get sort of obsessed with birds. I don't know quite, I mean, I'd always been interested in birds, but I was like, you know, I joined Birdwatch Ireland, and I read the Wings magazine sort of avidly, and I found myself in the evening not sewing, but sitting there like with the bird book as though it were like a gripping novel, just, you know, turning the pages and going, oh my God, there's something called a twite. And then wanting to know what color the twite's plumage was between male and female, and then what colors changed when they were juveniles. And it's weird the way these things suddenly come around, and they're like, they're of, you know, strange importance to you, and you retain the information, whereas there's so many other things that I forget. But anyway, gradually the birds, after moving it around the feeder and the table and trying various different things, we have a good population of them now, as good as it can be. I think suburban gardens will always actually get better birds, because you've more trees around you, and maybe because, you know, maybe you stole your goldfinches from some other like little old lady down the road who had a dedicated flock, and now they've all gone.
I'd say they're greedy.
Like our peanuts. So but it's funny, like the other morning, the very first little bird that we attracted, songbird, was a great tit, and we called him. We were like, oh my God, it's a great tit eating from our feeder, and we called him Graham. And I looked out the other day, and I literally went, oh, Graham, and then I went, and Graham, and Graham. And Graham. I turned to it. There's about 6 or 7 of them, but I said to Mark, I don't know which one is Graham anymore.
Too difficult. You know, I'm excited that currently there's coal tits have arrived.
Oh yeah, but we've never had a coal tit. We've blue tits and great tits, but what is it about the coal tit, I wonder?
It's the smallest of them, I know, but also I was really offended reading. I've got my props here. I have my bird book, which lives by the window, so that's how I know it was a coal tit. But I was really offended reading in this one about the blue tit. They said such a common bird, often known as the trash bird. I was like, rude. Anyway, that kind of research brings me on to another thing that I wanted to ask you about. Is so reading the book, there's so many references to visual artists that have inspired you. And when I was I hadn't made the connection between your second novel and the artist Richard Long, because I hadn't been aware of his work. I had been aware of, and when I was researching, I saw his work and then was aware of Andy Goldsworthy's work and went, oh, that's obviously where Andy Goldsworthy got a lot of inspiration. So now I'm really interested in Richard Long, and you're peppered throughout Handiwork are lovely references to visual artists. Like I wrote down some the William van Genk, all of these people who I'd never heard of that I now have pictures in my head from. I had auditory pictures and then had gone off to look. And so how does research play a part in your practice, or does it?
Well, it does, but I never think either, oh, I'm having a dedicated period of research now, you know. Like I suppose I read and I, you know, pursue documentaries and podcasts and things like that. And I guess with the birds, it was more, you know, walking and watching. And I did some courses with the Cape Clear Bird Observatory. That comes in at the end of the novel. Sorry, not the novel, the book. And so I'm researching, but it doesn't feel arduous in that way, I suppose. For me, it's always like something that really grabs me, a sort of an obsession that I'm then working out of my system, reading things that relate to it, or finding things in it that relate. It's finding things that make a connection almost naturally. Like at the moment, I'm doing a project that's a project about ships, about model ships, and it sort of started years ago in 2013 with this one particular ship that is in the collection of Cove Museum in Cork Harbour. And it was a World War I hospital ship, and it was sort of scratch built, which is a term I talk about in handiwork. But very little was known about it. It had come from the First World War. It had been sort of donated to the museum, and so I kind of got obsessed with it and tried to find out who'd made it. And I wrote a piece that became a radio essay for Sunday Miscellany. And then this sort of stayed with me for years. And only this year have I started making model container ships, sort of. But it was through a very small sort of something else sort of became the catalyst. Some connection that you make sort of gives you the excuse to do the thing. And then quite often the research sort of goes backwards in the sense that I might be working on a project like the model ships for months or years. And then you kind of feel like, oh God, what am I doing? Maybe I should write something about this that sort of explains it or condones it in some way. So I'm always kind of, I'm both reading and sort of researching and writing and making, and they all sort of coalesce, and sometimes one comes before the other, and I never really feel like I'm studying hard and researching something. And when I'm invited to do things, sort of commissions that didn't come organically from things that fascinate me, I usually say no, unless I really need the money. I just find that I can't pretend interest in something and sustain that for a long time.
Yeah, and that's when I was thinking about it, it felt like your research is much more in absorbing of like or not absorbing, the opposite, the outpouring of your absorptions. And similarly, when I was researching you, I found your top 5 books was listed somewhere, and they were all visual art books, which I thought was interesting. Now that may have changed, obviously, when anybody is asked to put pen to paper about your top 5 anything. I think it's of that moment, your favorite songs or anything like that.
I can't remember what they were, so that'll probably tell you.
But they were all visual art books that I was then interested to go off and look. And my relationship with visual art books are kind of objects that I want to keep. So a little bit like the objects that you describe in various times that have come into your life that have resonance. That's how I feel about my art books that are, I see an artist that I'm interested in. And certainly, like, I was looking up to buy a book about Richard Long. After learning about him, I was going, wouldn't that be a nice text to absorb? And they become kind of, furniture in the house, they become decoration, but then they kind of have secret in them that I want to go and look. And it feels so like a small sense of ownership over them because they're full of the visual. And then quite often that bleeds into work. There are a number of images that keep becoming the first inspiration board image for a theatre show. They speak to things that I'm interested in. So I empathize with that. And then it was William Morris. That was another thing that I was interested in us talking about because of his intersection. A little bit, we touched on the difference between art for art's sake and the idea of design and craft. Maybe we touched on that. And the way you write about him and his work found no difference in that. So Morris, calling yourself a disciple of Morris, what does Morris and his work mean to you, and how does it connect?
Well, it's funny because around the same time I started reading Morris's books and his lectures, really. I didn't read everything. He has a crazy science fiction novel, and he wrote lots of like questionable poetry. But his objects, I like the fact that he was like a man who he wanted to do anything. He did a bit of everything, and it all sort of fed in together and made sense. But around the same time, they started somewhere like H&M or Topshop. Was it Topshop? Started doing a range of like William Morris prints. And
I think maybe his work became out of copyright or something like that, because there was.
I think that must have been it. Yeah.
So certainly H&M had a whole range of it. But proceed.
Maybe H&M, but I was disgusted because it was so against what Morris himself believed in. The idea of fast fashion, something made carelessly and churned out and then bought cheaply, was so oppositional to Morris. So I felt the need to reclaim him a little bit, which is why he went in. But could I read an extract, because that probably better explains my connection to Morris and how it kind of it brought in a few other things. Now Morris, I'll just read a quick quote that came from another book, a novel called The Cave by Jose Saramago. I'll just read it briefly because it relates to the bit that I then wrote about Morris. Indeed, very few people are aware, Jose Saramago writes in The Cave, that in each of our fingers, located somewhere between the first phalange, the mesophalange, and the metaphalange, there is a tiny brain. So I kept picking up on this idea of there being a brain in your hands that works separately to the brain in your head. William Morris, artist, designer, writer, activist, socialist, agreed that hands know what they must do without instruction, and that the objects shaped by their ancestors' phalanxes and phalanges and metacarpals for thousands of years remain in the memory compartment of their tiny brains, in the same way as birds know which way to fly without being guided or following a plotted course, without a book that provides detailed drawings and plans with parts and kits to accompany it. No man, however original he may be, Morris writes in the Lesser Arts, can sit down day to day and draw the ornament of a cloth or the form of an ordinary vessel or a piece of furniture that will be other than a development or a degradation of forms used hundreds of years ago. And these too, very often, forms that once had a serious meaning, though they are now become little more than a habit of the hand, forms that were once perhaps the mysterious symbols of worships and beliefs now little remembered or wholly forgotten. So I liked all the time the idea that we still have this sort of residue of our ancestors and the way that they used their hands. In the same way that the birds remember their routes of migration, we're still sort of doing things or trying inadequately to do things that are written into the history of our bodies in a way. He was a wealthy man, an intellectual, and yet Morris chose his workshop over and above his desk. He was more likely to be found wearing a dye-stained smock than the velveteen smoking jacket of a Victorian gentleman. In the arts and crafts movement in Britain, Mary Greenstead describes him as short, stocky, and extravagantly bearded, in a bright blue fisherman's shirt and a soft, battered hat. I consider myself a disciple of Morris for his doctrine of truth to nature and to materials and to people. Art must derive from daily life, he believed, and the person who labours must be inseparable from the product of their labour. It must synchronously be a product of their will, their pains, their talents, their tenderness. I'll just skip a page, and then this bit seems important. Morris was influenced by traditional Islamic art, partly for the reason that craft work like pottery, carpet weaving, calligraphy, and embroidery are conferred an equal status to painting and sculpture, and partly because in the Islamic tradition it is considered less important to replicate the details of nature than it is to convey their essence. In the Islamic tradition, every pattern is sourced in the sacred, and every person in the workshop is trained with equal emphasis placed upon becoming a skilled artisan and becoming a decent, whole person, disciplined, humane, spiritual. And so, like, I just love this idea that because his socialism very much fed into his making of stuff and how he organized his workshop. And I love the idea that that, you know, in the absence of religion, that we have sort of this other religion of working hard and spending time with stuff and finishing it, executing it well. I'm always looking for sort of an excuse to find religious, you know, connections with religion in art, but more through sort of worship and ritual as opposed to spirituality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I was reading an article this morning about how we will pay for art in this digital world, and it's just resonating with me. But the writer who was talking about a particular book was referencing that, you know, once visual art, which was always a commerce in some ways, that, you know, the Sistine Chapel wouldn't have been painted except for it was work. So these great artworks are not just made from inspiration, they were also commissioned, and there was that process of paying for the work, so that the visual art output is often a commissioned work. So would Michelangelo's work be considered craft or design in this context, that we're kind of playing with that idea? And they were saying that once visual art became, you know, they were kind of saying in the early 20th century that visual art became a secular religion, sort of thing, was what they were referencing. So maybe you have something in it there. And so I think, I mean, I'm aware that we've probably been talking for a little while now, and we should be probably winding up our conversation. But I have one question. Well, I have two questions, I think. One is the idea that, and I'm not hugely well versed in this notion, but it has been something that has been brought up, and I've read about the idea that young women writers find themselves more critiqued or assumed that the work that they write is more autobiographical than they necessarily admit to. So I thought that was interesting in regard to your two first novels, and then that while I think the first novel may have, because it had a male narrator, may have escaped that comparison quite so much, or a male voice, not a narrator, but and then with the second work, you openly admitted, at least it seems to be, that there was definite connections with things that had happened in your own life while it was fictionalized. And then we get to Handiwork, which is non-fiction. It's very much not a diary entry, but certainly a notebook of thoughts, or it feels like a very personal outpouring. And how does that feel? Or did you find any of that critique difficult when you were beginning, or when Simmer's Spill came out, or was it relevant to you at all?
Yeah, it's funny. With Spill Simmer, I was more commonly asked, the sort of default question was always, you are a young woman and you are writing an older male character, and how can you do this? And so no one made the connection that it kind of was me, that he was based on me. I think it was brave of me in hindsight to do that, as in I wouldn't assume to write a character like that again. Like, for example, the character was 57, and what tripped me up constantly talking about it in the years after was I would refer to him as an old man. And men and women of all, both men and women over 55 would come up to me afterwards and go, "That's not old," and it doesn't seem old to me now, even just sort of several years on. So you kind of, there was too many. I was trying so hard to write a novel which seemed like a novel that someone else would write, not that someone else would write, I suppose, but that seemed like the kind of novel I would read, that had a beginning, middle, and end, and things happened and there was a trajectory. And then when that did well, that sort of gave me permission to write versions of my own story. And I suppose that's what I've been doing since. That was what I haven't written any short stories in years, and it's because when I started learning to write, I wrote, reasonably traditional short stories that were good, and and I won prizes for them. But as soon as I felt I had permission to write, as soon as I felt that someone had told me I was good at writing, I stopped trying to write and just started putting down on paper, or in the laptop or whatever, the things, the stories about my own version of the world that needed to be told. And that sounds very self-absorbed, but it's not that it's necessarily about me, but it's about the things that are affecting the world that I live in. And I can only write about them from my own point of view. And there are some writers, like your Hilary Mantels or whatever, who could imagine much more and can write about and can write elaborate stories about their can imagine, I suppose. But that's not really what I'm doing. I want to write. I desperately want to write and to make things that do come out of my time this time, because I think that's kind of all that we can do as an artists, that by constantly going to the past and sort of bringing things up from the past, maybe it sheds light on where we are now, or what has formed us, but it also needs to be of its time in order to last. I've gone way off topic there.
No, but it was really interesting, and I was nodding vigorously here, particularly about the importance of saying the thing that only you can say, which, I think that's, it to be true to the things that are interesting and inspiring you, and are being the small bit of sand in the sole of your shoe, or whatever, I agree, is the only thing that you can honestly do. So
and I think, sorry, I also think we live at a time where it's almost impossible to be original. There's so many books and so much art out there, and so all you can do is kind of tell it from your point of view. And if you really authentically care and try hard, then it can't be bad art. The only bad art is art that's trying to be someone else's art. If you do it your way, even if it's not completely original, then it's true, and that's okay. It's good.
I completely agree. And then that kind of brings us to my last question, which is, what is currently obsessing you, or what are the current things that will come out in the next number of years' work? What are the things that you're reading about, or making, or sanding away at, that will inevitably come out? I think.
Well, I should give a little heads up to for anyone who enjoyed Handiwork and then possibly also the book on one readings. There's a documentary on lyric that I made with a wonderful radio producer called Regan Hutchins, and it's kind of like a slanted view of Handiwork. So it's handiwork with no script in a way. So it's about a cross stitch project, but it's also just about this weekend that we spent on Cape last year. And which we sort of tried to be bird watchers and followed other bird watchers around and made spaghetti in the bird observatory. And I hope it will be kind of funny as well. So that's on, I think it's the lyric feature. So it's around 6 or 7 on this Sunday. So I'd love to give that a shout out, but I mean, that's made. And then at the moment, or next year, and who knows, it's so hard to say what will happen and what won't. But I'm working on a show, or I will be working on a show that's really the brainchild of Brendan McEvely, who produces a magazine called Holy Show. It's quite new, but the idea of it is contemporary culture, you know, and how the arts respond. So it's not fiction, it's all sort of true, and there's a lot of art and photography in it. It's a brilliant journal. He's only done 2 issues, and the third, there will be, I will do a sort of feature that's about, it riffs on handiwork, but it's not handiwork. It's about obsession, really. And we hope to tour a little production that's like an alternative literature show. So it's by no means just reading, but there will be me reading, and then there will also be a couple of short films that take in 3 or 4 other artists, Gary Coyle and Laura Fitzgerald, and a musician called Irene Buckley. And I'm not sure yet, things are still sort of being finalized and I haven't seen the films, but there'll be a few short films that riff on this theme of obsession, and I'll be reading and making something out of that, which is it's all up in the air at the moment, and it's so hard to say whether we'll be doing it for real or not, you know. But then the thing, yeah, and then model ships. I'm obsessed with model ships at the moment. Model ships, container ships, pirates. It's all kind of riffing on the same theme, mainly church ships, which are kind of votive objects. I always keep coming around to this sort of connection to ritual and to trying to substitute in my life the religion that I've lost. So I'm very interested in talismans and sort of grottos and things like that as well. So yeah, ships.
Ships. Well, we look forward to that. Well, so just thank you so much there. I had a really enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So did I. It was just like, I don't know if anyone else enjoyed it, but we had a great chat.
We'll find out. And just want to thank 3 people who have been really helpful and have made this all happen. So Heather Troy Whelan, who has been so helpful to us organizing all of making us look and sound hopefully as well as we can. Also Nora Boland, who has gone above and beyond both with this and the Imagine Festival. So having the rug pulled out from under us all in the whole world, but particularly thank you so much to Nora, and then to Emer Chasey, who paired us. And I think thank you, Emer. I'm really glad that we've got to have this conversation, and I will be listening avidly. I had heard that it was going to be advertised, or I heard it advertised, so I'm looking forward to listening to your lyric feature, Sarah. So thanks a million.
Thank you.
And thanks a million to everybody, and hope stay safe as we should all be doing. Thanks and goodbye.